The morning of choices. The morning sun had not yet risen above the rooftops of South Elmwood when Gabriella Moore wrapped her baby daughter, Amara, in a faded pink blanket and tucked her gently against her chest. The one-room apartment she rented smelled faintly of baby powder, instant coffee, and hope that refused to die even after too many nights of counting coins. The small heater in the corner buzzed weakly, trying to fight off the early chill of spring. Gabriella's uniform, a simple black maid's dress with a white collar, hung on the back of a chair, pressed as best as she could manage with an old iron that hissed steam like a tired sigh. She checked her reflection in the mirror, dark brown skin glistening with the faint moisture of nerves, eyes rimmed with exhaustion but bright with purpose, hair tied neatly under a scarf. She whispered to herself, "We can do this, baby girl. Just one more day, one more paycheck." Outside, the streets were still half asleep. Delivery trucks rumbled past the cracked sidewalks, and a few other early risers trudged toward the bus stop carrying coffee cups and dreams of survival. Gabriella moved quickly, careful not to wake her elderly landlady downstairs. The daycare 2 blocks away was supposed to open at 6, but when she arrived at the gate, a handwritten sign taped to the metal bars read, "Closed today, staff emergency." Her stomach dropped. Amara stirred slightly, her little hand clutching a lock of her mother's hair, unaware of the storm about to unfold. Gabriella glanced at her phone. 6:15. If she didn't make the 7 o'clock bus, she'd be late again. One more warning from Mrs. Winslow, the house manager at Sterling Heights Mansion, and she would lose the only job keeping their fragile world from collapse. She stood there for a moment in the cold, the decision heavy as a stone in her chest. Leave her daughter with a neighbor she barely knew? Impossible. Call her employer? Ridiculous. Maids didn't call millionaires. And so, with a deep breath that trembled at the edges, she whispered to the baby, "Looks like you're coming with Mama today." The bus ride felt longer than usual. The wheels hummed over the cracked asphalt, and every turn seemed to test her courage. Around her, the world split into 2 colors, the gray of the working class and the shining gold of the city's upper hills. When the bus finally stopped near the private gate of Sterling Heights, Gabriella stepped down, tightening her hold on Amara, who cooed softly under the blanket. The mansion rose before her like something from a movie: white pillars, glass walls, and a long driveway lined with imported trees trimmed to perfection. She took the service entrance as always, heart pounding as she pushed open the back door that led directly into the kitchen. The aroma of roasted coffee and butter met her immediately. The kitchen gleamed, rows of copper pans hanging in perfect order, marble counters polished until they reflected the light like water. Louise, the head cook, was already bustling around, stirring a pot of oatmeal on the stove. When she saw Gabriella, her eyebrows shot up. "You've got the baby with you?" she whispered sharply. "Mrs. Winslow will have your hide if she sees that." "I had no choice," Gabriella murmured, setting her bag down near the back pantry. "Daycare's closed. I'll keep her quiet, I promise." She spread a small blanket in the corner and laid Amara gently on it, placing a soft rattle beside her. The baby gurgled happily, tapping the toy against the floor, oblivious to the mansion's silence. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Gabriella polished the crystal vases, dusted the grand piano in the foyer, and wiped the long dining table until her reflection stared back at her from the dark wood. She worked quickly, praying that no one important would appear before she finished. The mansion's owner, Marcus Sterling, rarely woke before 10. He was a man of wealth and mystery, an investment magnate whose name appeared in newspapers and on charity gala invitations, but who had lived behind guarded gates since the death of his wife 3 years ago. People whispered that grief had turned him into stone, that no one dared disturb his solitude. But fate has a strange sense of timing. At 9:30, just as Gabriella was gathering her cleaning supplies from the hall, she heard a soft giggle echo across the marble floor. Amara, who had managed to crawl a few steps away from her blanket, was sitting in the middle of the living room carpet, tapping her little hand against the leg of an antique armchair. The sound of footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, echoing through the high-ceilinged hallway. Gabriella froze. Marcus Sterling entered the room, dressed in a gray sweater and dark trousers, his usual armor of detachment slightly loosened by the morning light. His salt and pepper hair framed a face both handsome and weary, as if life had given him everything except peace. His eyes, cold and analytical in meetings, softened with confusion at the sight before him. A tiny child, giggling amid the polished perfection of his empty home. Gabriella's heart raced. She dropped her mop, rushing forward. "Sir, I'm so sorry. Please, I'll take her right away. It won't happen again." She scooped Amara into her arms, expecting a reprimand, maybe even dismissal, but Marcus didn't speak immediately. Instead, he crouched slightly, his gaze fixed on the baby who was now smiling at him with that fearless innocence only children possess. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. "Amara," Gabriella whispered, clutching her tighter. He nodded as if the name itself carried weight. "Beautiful name. Means grace, doesn't it?" She blinked, surprised that he knew. "Yes, sir." For a moment, silence filled the space. Not the awkward silence of class divide, but something gentler, fragile, like a bridge forming between two distant shores. Then Marcus did something that would be remembered in that house for years to come. He smiled. Not the polite smile of the wealthy, but a real one that reached his eyes. "She looks like she could use a tour of the place," he said softly. "Let her stay. Just for today." Gabriella was too stunned to speak. "Sir, that's very kind, but—" He lifted a hand, stopping her apology before it could form. "No child should be left behind because adults forgot how to be kind," he said. Then glancing toward the grand piano, he added almost to himself, "This house has been silent for too long." He turned to leave, his footsteps retreating up the stairs, leaving Gabriella standing there with tears stinging her eyes. Louise peeked in from the kitchen door wide-eyed. "Did I just see Mr. Sterling smile at a baby?" she whispered. Gabriella nodded, still dazed. "Then heaven's real," Louise muttered, returning to her pots. The rest of the morning passed in a dream. Marcus didn't leave for the office that day. He stayed home, walking through the garden, pausing once to watch from a distance as Gabriella fed Amara her bottle near the kitchen window. Later, when he came down for lunch, he found the two of them quietly folding napkins by the counter, and without a word he took one from her hands and folded it too. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of transformation. By evening, the mansion felt alive again. The staff, once stiff with protocol, began to laugh more freely. The gardener brought in fresh roses for the dining table. Louise baked a batch of cookies, for the little one, though everyone knew she'd baked them for herself too. And Marcus, usually gone by sunset, sat in the living room reading a newspaper while Amara toddled around chasing a ball he'd rolled her way. When Gabriella finally gathered her things to leave, Marcus stopped her at the door. "Miss Moore," he said formally, though his voice was gentle, "you've done excellent work here. Don't worry about today. In fact, if it ever happens again, if you have no one to watch her, you bring her." "Understood?" Tears welled up in Gabriella's eyes. "Thank you, sir. You don't know what that means to me." He gave a small nod. "Maybe I do," he said, eyes flicking briefly toward an old photograph on the wall, a woman holding a baby who would never grow up. Then clearing his throat, he added, "Good night, Miss Moore. Take care of her. And yourself." That night, as Gabriella carried Amara back through the rain-damp streets toward their small apartment, she felt lighter than she had in years. Not because her problems had vanished, they hadn't, but because someone, for once, had seen her not as a servant, not as a burden, but as a human being. She whispered to her daughter as the bus rattled home, "Maybe kindness still lives in this world after all." And far away, in the great silent halls of Sterling Heights, Marcus sat alone in the dim living room, a forgotten cookie beside his untouched coffee, listening to the faint echo of a baby's laughter that had somehow filled the cracks in his broken heart. For the first time since his wife's death, he didn't feel alone. The day the mansion woke up. The following morning dawned beneath a sky painted with soft rose and silver clouds, and somewhere in the middle of that sleepy stillness, Gabriella's alarm clock shrilled its familiar metallic cry. She rose before it could ring twice, gently shifting little Amara, who had rolled against her side during the night. The room smelled faintly of the soap she had used to scrub the floor the previous evening, and as she moved about dressing, tying her scarf, warming milk on the old stove, her mind kept returning to the unbelievable kindness of the day before. She replayed Marcus Sterling's words, "Bring her. No child should be left behind because adults forgot how to be kind." Those words had folded themselves deep inside her heart, like a prayer she was too afraid to repeat aloud. The world had rarely been gentle to her, And yet yesterday, within walls built for the powerful, a man everyone described as unreachable had looked at her child with softness instead of scorn. That memory was enough to give her courage. By the time she reached the mansion gates, the morning mist had begun to thin, revealing the trimmed hedges glistening with dew and the white gravel path sparkling faintly in the early light. She adjusted her uniform, balanced Amara on her hip, and greeted the guard with a nod. Inside, the kitchen was already alive with the rhythmic sounds of preparation. The scrape of knives against chopping boards, the clatter of plates, the low hum of conversation. Louise, the cook, looked up from the counter where she was kneading dough, her plump face breaking into a cautious smile. "Morning, Gabriella. Guess what? He's home again today." Gabriella's hand froze on the doorknob. "Mr. Sterling? He's not at the office?" Louise shook her head, said he'd be working from home. "Ordered breakfast served in the garden. And he asked if—" She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "The little angel might be joining you again." Gabriella's breath caught. Gratitude and worry tangled inside her like vines competing for space. She wanted to smile, but fear still whispered from the corners of her mind. Wealthy men's moods change faster than weather. Kindness could vanish without warning. Still, she laid Amara's blanket in the same corner of the kitchen as yesterday, her heart thudding with hope. A little later, while polishing the silver trays in the dining room, she heard the deep timbre of Marcus Sterling's voice from the hallway. Not the clipped business tone his staff usually feared, but a softer register, calm and unhurried. He entered carrying a file under his arm, but paused when he saw Amara now sitting upright, tapping her spoon against the floor. For a moment he simply watched her, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "She seems comfortable here," he said. Gabriella turned quickly, her face flushing. "I hope she's not disturbing anyone, sir. I'll keep her close to me." He shook his head lightly. "Disturbing? Quite the opposite. This house has needed noise like that for a long time." He looked around the vast dining room, the sunlight cutting through the tall windows and igniting the crystal chandelier into 1,000 sparks. "For years I thought silence meant peace. Turns out it only meant emptiness." His honesty disarmed her. Most rich men she had served spoke in commands or compliments sharpened like knives. Marcus spoke as if he were thinking aloud, letting the truth stand naked between them without ceremony. "You have a gift," he added suddenly. Gabriella blinked. "A gift, sir?" "For finding calm in chaos," he said, almost smiling again. "You move quietly, but the room changes when you're in it. My wife used to say that real grace is invisible until it's gone." The mention of his late wife hung in the air like the lingering scent of perfume. Gabriella bowed her head respectfully. "She must have been a remarkable woman." "She was," he replied, voice softening. "And I think she would have liked you." He turned then, as though embarrassed by the intimacy of his own words, and left for the garden. But Gabriella stood motionless for a long moment, feeling the warmth of something she had not felt in years: dignity. By midday, the mansion had taken on a different rhythm. Clara Winslow, the house manager, who had always run the place like a general commanding troops, noticed it first. The staff were lighter on their feet, laughter broke out in the corridors, and even the gardener hummed as he trimmed the hedges. Marcus, once invisible behind closed doors, now walked the halls with quiet interest, pausing to ask the names of the people who had served him unseen for years. When he stopped by the kitchen, he found Gabriella preparing the tea tray. Amara sat on the counter under Louise's watchful eye, playing with a wooden spoon. "You don't have to rush," Marcus said as he entered, rolling up his sleeves. "Tea can wait." Gabriella turned, startled. "Sir, you shouldn't be here." "The kitchen's, well, it's messy." He gave a low chuckle. "That's what makes it real. My boardroom is sterile. This," he gestured around to the flour-dusted counters and steaming pots, "this is life." Louise's mouth fell open, unused to the sight of her employer leaning against her counter like a neighbor dropping by for coffee. He looked toward Amara, who squealed with delight at the sight of his cufflinks catching the light. He unfastened one and held it up like a tiny toy. "You like shiny things, huh?" he said, placing it gently in her small hand. "Careful, young lady, that's worth more than my first car." Everyone laughed softly, even Clara, who had appeared at the doorway, frozen with disbelief. Something extraordinary was unfolding. The hierarchy that had ruled the mansion for decades was dissolving, replaced by an atmosphere of simple humanity. Later that afternoon, while the others were busy with their duties, Marcus sat in his study surrounded by folders of figures and contracts. Yet the numbers blurred before his eyes. Instead, he kept hearing the echo of Amara's laughter from downstairs. He had spent years building empires and collecting art, yet nothing had ever felt as grounding as that child's laughter, or the calm steadiness of the young woman who carried her. He realized he wanted to understand her, not just her work ethic, but her story. As dusk began to settle, he called Gabriella to the library. The tall shelves glowed amber in the lamplight, and the faint crackle of the fireplace filled the silence between them. She entered nervously, wiping her hands on her apron, uncertain why she'd been summoned. "Please sit," Marcus said, motioning toward the armchair opposite his desk. She hesitated, then obeyed, feeling small among the towering shelves. "I wanted to ask," he began slowly, "how long have you been with us?" "6 months, sir," she replied softly. "And before that?" She lowered her gaze. "Before that, I worked part-time at a laundromat. Before that, wherever I could, restaurants, cleaning offices. It's just me and Amara, her father. He left before she was born." Marcus studied her face. There was no bitterness there, only quiet endurance. "You've had to be strong," he said. She nodded once. "You learned to be." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "Do you know why I keep this mansion?" he asked. "It's not because I like it. It's because it was hers, my wife's. She loved this house. After she passed, I told myself keeping it perfect was honoring her memory. But lately I've realized I turned it into a museum of grief. Until you walked in with your daughter yesterday, it hadn't felt alive in 3 years. Tears stung Gabriella's eyes, and she clasped her hands tightly to keep them from trembling. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to intrude on your memories." He shook his head gently. "You didn't intrude, Gabriella. You reminded me what they meant." He paused, then said quietly, "I'd like you to consider something. How would you feel about becoming a full-time caretaker here? Not just cleaning, but managing some of the household routines. And if it helps, I'll make sure there's a proper space where Amara can stay safely while you work." She stared at him, speechless. The offer sounded unreal. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he said with a small smile, "because I think you've already begun changing this house more than I ever could." The room seemed to expand around her with the weight of that kindness. No one had ever offered her anything except survival. Now someone was offering trust. She nodded slowly, voice breaking as she murmured, "Yes, sir. Thank you. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," he said, standing to shake her hand, something he had never done with a member of his staff. Her palm was rough from years of scrubbing floors, his smooth from signing deals, but the handshake bridged more than just social ranks. It sealed a quiet promise between two wounded souls learning to rebuild through compassion. When Gabriella left the library that evening, the corridor seemed warmer, the paintings less severe, the air filled with an invisible hum of possibility. Downstairs, Louise had already prepared supper, and the staff gathered around the long kitchen table for the first shared meal anyone could remember. Marcus joined them halfway through, to everyone's astonishment, taking the empty chair beside Gabriella. Conversation stopped, forks paused midair. He smiled faintly. "Carry on," he said. "It smells too good to miss." They ate together while Amara babbled in her high chair, slapping her tiny palms against the tray. Laughter spilled across the kitchen like sunlight through an open window. For the first time in years, the Sterling mansion felt like a home instead of a fortress. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the lights dimmed, Gabriella stood at the gate waiting for her bus, holding her daughter close. She looked back at the great house glowing softly in the darkness and whispered, "You see that, baby? That's what kindness can do. It can wake up even the coldest places." And inside, Marcus Sterling stood at the same window, watching the two figures disappear down the street, a thought echoing quietly in his mind. Perhaps grace doesn't visit us from above, it walks in, tired and carrying a child. The rumor and the revelation. By the 3rd week after Marcus Sterling's unexpected act of kindness, the entire rhythm of the mansion had transformed so completely that even the walls seemed to breathe differently. The sharp formality that had once governed every sound and movement had softened into something almost musical. The house no longer echoed with loneliness. It hummed with the blended noise of footsteps, laughter, and the faint clatter of breakfast plates in the morning. Gabriella now moved through its corridors with a quiet confidence that astonished her. She was still the maid, Still the woman polishing silver and folding sheets, but there was dignity in every motion. A sense that her labor mattered not just for wages, but for warmth. Each day she arrived carrying Amara on her hip, and each day the child's presence filled the cold spaces with light. The staff adored the baby. Louise, the cook, always slipped her tiny pieces of bread. Clara Winslow, the once stern house manager, caught herself humming lullabies while arranging fresh flowers. It was as though a small soul had retaught them the forgotten art of tenderness. Marcus noticed everything. He watched from the veranda as Gabriella tended the rose garden in the afternoon light, her laughter mingling with her daughter's babbling. He found himself smiling for no reason at all, something he had not done in years. The mansion that had once been a monument to his grief was slowly becoming a sanctuary of rebirth. Yet in the world beyond those iron gates, curiosity was beginning to stir. Wealth attracts whispers, and kindness from wealth attracts suspicion. Drivers who delivered goods to the mansion had started exchanging murmurs in the city cafes. The boss lets a maid bring her baby to work. Can you imagine? Must be something more to it. By the time one of Marcus's business associates heard the story, it had already been twisted into scandal. That associate was Jonathan Reed, a man of polished shoes, perfect suits and eyes that measured people like assets. He had been Marcus's partner in several real estate ventures, ambitious to the point of obsession. When Jonathan arrived unannounced one bright Monday morning, he was greeted by the unusual sight of Gabriella kneeling in the hallway, guiding little Amara's first unsteady steps across the marble floor while Marcus stood a few feet away, clapping encouragement. The child toddled forward, wobbled, and collapsed into laughter that echoed through the grand foyer. Marcus bent and lifted her gently, his expression soft with pride. Jonathan's lips tightened into a line so thin it almost disappeared. "Well," he said after a pause, his tone halfway between amusement and disbelief, "I didn't realize the Sterling estate had turned into a daycare." The remark sliced through the air like a blade. Gabriella stiffened immediately and took Amara back into her arms, lowering her gaze. Marcus straightened slowly, the warmth draining from his face. "Jonathan," he said evenly, "you're early." Jonathan walked further inside, his eyes sweeping over the gleaming floors. "Early enough to see what's become of this place. I hardly recognize it." He gestured vaguely toward Gabriella. "Is this the help?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "This is Ms. Moore, my housekeeper, and the child is her daughter." "Ah," Jonathan said with a dry chuckle. "A housekeeper with daycare privileges. You always were a sentimental one under all that steel." The insult was thinly veiled, but Marcus didn't rise to it. He simply replied, "If being sentimental means remembering that people are not machines, then yes, perhaps I am." He turned to Gabriella. "It's all right. Please continue your work." She nodded silently and slipped away toward the kitchen, heart pounding. She had heard that tone before from men who believed kindness was weakness. In the kitchen, she placed Amara in her crib near the window and began peeling apples for Louise's pie, trying to drown her anxiety in the steady rhythm of work. Meanwhile, in the study, Jonathan poured himself a drink without asking. "Marcus, you need to be careful," he said in a low voice. "The staff is talking, the city is talking. You're inviting gossip that could ruin your reputation. Investors like predictability, not melodrama." Marcus looked out the window where sunlight filtered through the rose bushes. "Reputation built on coldness isn't worth preserving," he said quietly. "Coldness?" Jonathan scoffed. "It's professionalism. You start blurring lines with servants, people assume things. You know how they talk. They'll turn compassion into scandal before the week is over." Marcus turned slowly, his gaze firm. "Let them talk. For once, I don't intend to live by their definitions." Jonathan set his glass down hard enough to make it ring. "You're throwing away the image we built. The disciplined, untouchable chairman. The board won't like it." "Then the board can adjust," Marcus replied, voice calm but final. "Because this house at least will be ruled by decency." The two men stared at each other, the unspoken war between money and morality flickering in the silence. Jonathan left soon after, muttering something about meetings and press optics. But as his car disappeared down the driveway, Gabriella sensed the tension that lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. She feared her presence had placed a target on Marcus's back, and the thought filled her with dread. That evening, as she packed her bag to leave, Marcus appeared at the kitchen door. The usual ease in his eyes was gone, replaced by quiet thoughtfulness. "Gabriella," he said softly, "I owe you an apology. My friend was rude. He doesn't understand what we've built here." She shook her head quickly. "Please, sir, you don't owe me anything. People talk, it's the world. I just don't want to cause you trouble." He walked a few steps closer, his expression earnest. "Do you believe what we're doing is wrong? Making space for a child, for kindness, for laughter?" "No, sir," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "I think it's the best thing that's ever happened to this house." "Then we'll endure the rest," he said quietly. "Let them talk. The truth will outlast the noise." For a moment they stood in silence, the kitchen lit only by the golden glow of the hanging lamps. In that soft light, the distance between Millionaire and Maid seemed to vanish entirely. He looked not at an employee, but at a fellow human being who had faced the same world's harshness and refused to break. The next few days brought the storm he had predicted. An online gossip column published a photograph of Marcus kneeling beside Amara in the garden, taken through the fence by a curious passerby. The headline screamed, "Reclusive tycoon finds comfort in Maid's child." Within hours, the article spread, accompanied by speculation, judgment, and lies. Marcus's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from reporters and board members demanding statements. Clara Winslow tried to intercept them, but the damage was done. Gabriella read the article on her way home, the words burning into her like acid. She felt shame and fury in equal measure, though she had done nothing wrong. At home, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at Amara asleep in her arms, and whispered, "Maybe I should quit before they destroy him because of us." The next morning, she arrived at the mansion prepared to resign. But when she entered the foyer, she found Marcus already waiting. He was dressed not in his usual tailored suit, but in a simple open-necked shirt, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. "You've seen the news," he said before she could speak. "Yes, sir," she murmured. "And I think maybe I should leave until things settle." He shook his head firmly. "You'll do no such thing." He held up his phone, showing her the post he had written himself. It read, "For those asking, the photograph is real. The child's name is Amara, and her mother, Gabriella Moore, is part of my household. We are not ashamed of decency. The world could use more of it." Her eyes widened. You said that publicly." "I did," he said simply, "because hiding kindness is how cruelty wins." The statement went viral within hours, not as scandal, but as inspiration. Thousands of comments poured in from around the country, single mothers thanking him, workers praising the courage to defend dignity. What had begun as gossip turned into a movement. Newspapers that had once printed rumors now wrote editorials titled, "The House That Kindness Rebuilt." Inside the mansion, the atmosphere changed again, but this time it was pride that filled the air. The staff walked taller, aware they worked in a place that stood for something larger than wealth. Louise began organizing leftover meals for a local shelter with Marcus's blessing. Clara suggested turning one of the unused rooms into a small play area for employees' children, and within a week, Marcus approved it. They painted the walls soft yellow, laid down rugs, and hung paper stars from the ceiling. Above the door, Gabriella hand-stitched a small fabric banner that read, "Nap Room." It was a simple gesture, but it symbolized the house's rebirth. One afternoon, as Marcus watched Amara asleep under that banner, he felt a peace he hadn't known since before tragedy had taken his wife. He realized that what he had lost was not love itself, but the courage to show it. Gabriella had reminded him of that courage. When she joined him at the doorway, he turned to her and said, "Do you see what your presence has done? You've turned a mansion into a home again." She smiled shyly, shaking her head. "No, sir." "You did that. You opened the door?" He looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps," he said softly, "but you brought the light that made me see it." Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of lavender and warm bread from the kitchen. The mansion glowed softly in the fading sunlight, no longer an island of wealth, but a beacon of hope. Inside its walls, people of every rank sat together at the same table, sharing stories, laughter, and crumbs of courage. And in the cradle near the window, little Amara stirred, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of her blanket as if holding the fragile thread that had woven all their lives together. The world beyond the gates could speculate all it wanted, but within, something far greater than gossip had taken root, a quiet revolution of compassion that no rumor could erase. When the storm tested the light, autumn crept over Sterling Heights mansion like a slow-burning fire, turning the maples on the long driveway into pillars of copper and gold. Inside, life pulsed with a steady, peaceful rhythm that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Each morning Gabriella arrived with Amara bundled against her chest, and the scent of brewed coffee, rising dough, and lavender polish wrapped around them like an embrace. Marcus had taken to joining the staff for breakfast, something no one could remember any master ever doing, and laughter had replaced the echo of loneliness that once haunted the hallways. The nap room upstairs had become a small symbol of change beyond the mansion. Other wealthy households in the city had begun adopting Sterling rooms for employees' children after reading Marcus's public statement. He had accidentally started a movement of quiet humanity that spread farther than he could see. Yet peace, as the seasons remind all who live too comfortably, is never permanent. It must be tested to prove its worth. The test came on an otherwise ordinary Thursday. Marcus was preparing to leave for a charity banquet downtown, the first public appearance he had agreed to since the scandal had turned into admiration. He was supposed to deliver a speech about corporate empathy and the importance of community, words that Gabriella had helped him shape late at night in the library while Amara slept between them on the couch. He had just adjusted his tie in the mirror when Clara burst into the room, breathless and pale. "Sir, it's Amara," she managed. "The baby's burning up with fever." The words cracked through the air like thunder. Marcus dropped everything and ran. In the small nursery they had built upstairs, Louise was pacing while Gabriella knelt beside the crib, one hand trembling on her daughter's forehead, the other clutching a damp cloth. The child's skin glistened with sweat, her breath shallow, her eyelids fluttering. Gabriella's usually steady composure had splintered into fear. "She was fine this morning," she whispered hoarsely. "Then she wouldn't eat, and now she's so hot, sir, I don't know what's happening." Marcus crouched beside her, feeling the heat radiating from the little body. Without hesitation, he said, "We're not wasting a second. Clara, tell the driver." "No, I'll drive." Within minutes they were in his black sedan, rain beginning to fall in thin silver lines across the windshield as the city blurred past. Gabriella sat in the back seat, holding Amara close, whispering prayers in a trembling rhythm that Marcus could hear even over the wiper blades. At the emergency entrance of St. Matthew's Hospital, he leapt out first, shouting for help. The sight of the famous Marcus Sterling running through the automatic doors with a soaked maid and a sick infant in his arms froze the staff for a heartbeat before the triage nurse moved them inside. A pediatrician rushed forward. Gabriella was ushered into a small room where Amara was laid on a narrow bed, monitors beeping softly. Marcus stood beside her, drenched and silent, feeling utterly powerless for the first time in years. Hours passed in slow agony. Doctors came and went, explaining terms that blurred together. Viral infection, elevated temperature, dehydration. But all Gabriella heard was the fragile sound of her baby's breathing. Marcus refused to leave her side. He called his own private physician to oversee treatment, ordered the best equipment, but it wasn't money that mattered in that moment. It was presence. At midnight, when Amara finally stabilized and drifted into light sleep, Gabriella broke down completely. Her tears came silently at first, then in shaking waves that left her breathless. Marcus, sitting on the chair beside her, placed his hand gently over hers. "She'll be all right," he said, voice raw with exhaustion. "She's strong, just like her mother." Gabriella wiped her face with the back of her hand, whispering, "You didn't have to stay, sir. You have a speech, the media waiting." He interrupted softly, "There's nothing out there more important than what's in this room." And in that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. Not romance, not obligation, but a deeper recognition of shared humanity. He had lost a child once long ago. She was fighting to keep hers alive. Their pain met in the quiet hospital light, each healing something the other didn't know was still wounded. By dawn, the doctor returned with a tired smile. "The fever's breaking," he said. "Your little girl will be fine. She just needs rest." Gabriella exhaled so hard it sounded like relief escaping from years of fear. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, thanking every unseen grace. When they returned to the mansion later that morning, the staff greeted them with tears and cheers. Louise had stayed up baking loaves of sweet bread for strength, and Clara had arranged fresh linens in the nursery. It was as if the whole house had held its breath through the night and could breathe again only when that baby's heartbeat steadied. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. News of Marcus's absence from the charity gala had spread, along with a leaked photograph of him carrying the baby through the hospital doors. Someone from the media had caught the moment. Instead of criticism, the picture ignited a wave of empathy that no PR campaign could have bought. The headline read, "Millionaire skips gala to save employee's child." Donations to children's hospitals doubled that week. Executives cited his act as proof that leadership meant more than profit. Marcus didn't read most of the articles. He spent those days upstairs, helping Gabriella spoon warm soup into Amara's mouth and reading softly from children's books he hadn't opened since his wife's time. One evening, as he watched the baby sleep, he turned to Gabriella and said quietly, "Funny, isn't it? People call it a gesture as if it were something I chose. But the truth is, she saved me first." Gabriella looked at him curiously. He continued, eyes distant. "After my wife and daughter died, I told myself I'd never care that deeply again. It felt safer to live behind glass. But when you walked in with Amara that morning, it was like the glass cracked and air rushed in. You brought life back into a dead house." Gabriella shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir. You let it in. You could have turned me away, but you didn't." He smiled faintly, not arguing. The silence that followed was gentle, not empty. A silence filled with mutual understanding. Weeks later, when winter began edging at the windows, the mansion held a small celebration, not for wealth or charity, but for gratitude. The staff gathered in the kitchen where everything had begun. Amara, now healthy, toddled between their legs, squealing with laughter. Marcus raised a glass of cider and spoke simply. "This house used to be about perfection. Now it's about people, and for that I thank every one of you. Especially two who reminded me that the smallest hands can rebuild the biggest hearts." Everyone clapped, and Gabriella felt tears prick her eyes as she held Amara close. The kitchen glowed with warmth, butter and cinnamon in the air, snow beginning to fall outside. But as the night drew on and laughter faded into quiet conversation, Marcus slipped out onto the veranda, staring at the white flakes settling over the dark garden. Gabriella followed a few moments later, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. He turned and smiled. "Cold out here," he said. She nodded, standing beside him. For a while, neither spoke. The world was too peaceful to disturb. Finally, she said softly, "Do you ever think about what people said before all the rumors?" He chuckled under his breath. "Every day. And I thank them. Without their noise, I might never have realized how much louder compassion can be." The snow thickened, catching the porch light in 1,000 glittering patterns. Amara's faint giggle floated through the open window. Gabriella looked at Marcus then, seeing not the millionaire of newspapers but a man transformed by empathy. He looked back at her and saw not the maid he had hired but the soul who had unknowingly rebuilt his faith in humanity. The storm that had tested them both was over, and what remained was stronger than pity, brighter than charity. It was genuine connection born from the simplest act of seeing another person as equal. And somewhere deep inside the sprawling house, beneath the hum of heaters and the whisper of falling snow, the old walls seemed to exhale in relief. They had witnessed arrogance, sorrow, and rumor. Now they witnessed rebirth. Sterling Heights was no longer just a mansion on a hill. It had become a living symbol of how grace survives its trials, not by avoiding storms, but by learning to hold light steady through them. The legacy of kindness. Winter slowly surrendered its grip, and with spring came a warmth that seemed to bloom not only in the gardens of Sterling Heights, but within the hearts of those who lived and worked inside its once silent walls. The world outside still remembered the viral story of the reclusive tycoon who had carried a maid's baby through the rain. But within those gates, no one spoke of fame or headlines anymore. They spoke of change, of belonging, of what it meant to find dignity where once there had been only duty. The mansion had become a living metaphor for healing, its polished marble now scuffed by the playful steps of a child, its boardrooms used for charity meetings instead of corporate conquests, its owner finally looking at the future without the filter of grief. Marcus spent his mornings in the garden, not inspecting but planting, kneeling beside the soil with the gardener who had once been invisible to him. Gabriella often joined them after finishing her chores, her laughter mingling with the hum of bees and the sound of Amara toddling nearby, chasing petals that the breeze carried just beyond her reach. Yet as peace settled, a quiet question began to form in Marcus's mind. What would happen when Gabriella's world and his inevitably had to part? He had offered her a new position months ago, one that included not just better pay but the respect of being called the house coordinator. She had refused promotion at first, saying softly, "I'm not sure the world would understand," but he insisted, "Then let's teach it how." Still, the boundary between gratitude and guilt weighed on him. He knew she had given him back purpose, and he wondered what he could ever give in return. That answer arrived one cool April morning, wrapped not in grandeur but in an envelope. It came from the city's council, inviting Marcus Sterling to speak at a symposium on ethical leadership. The theme was the human heart of business. Beneath the formal text was a handwritten note from the mayor himself. "Your story changed more minds than any policy. We would be honored if you shared it." Marcus sat in silence for a long time, then looked toward the kitchen where he could hear Gabriella singing to Amara as she cleaned. He smiled, realizing that his story was not his alone. It belonged to them all. When the day of the speech arrived, the auditorium was packed. Executives, journalists, and ordinary citizens filled every seat. Gabriella sat quietly near the back, Amara in her lap, wearing the tiny yellow dress Marcus had sent her as a gift. He took the stage, not in his usual designer suit, but in a simple dark blazer with rolled sleeves, a small orange flower pinned to his lapel, the same flowers that grew in the mansion garden where kindness had first taken root. The lights dimmed slightly, and for a moment he hesitated. Then, in a steady voice that carried both authority and humility, he began, "3 years ago," he said, "I lived in a house that had everything: space, silence, and success. What it didn't have was life. That changed when a young woman brought her baby to work one morning. She thought it would cost her everything. Instead, it gave us both back what we'd lost: faith in people." The audience leaned forward as he told them, not as headlines had written it, but as it truly happened. He spoke of fear, compassion, misunderstanding, and redemption. He described the lesson that had reshaped him. You don't rebuild a world with wealth. You rebuild it with warmth. The smallest acts, allowing a child to stay, forgiving a mistake, choosing empathy over image. These are what make a place worth living in. When he finished, there was no grand applause at first, only silence, the kind of silence that follows truth. Then the room erupted. Reporters rose to their feet. Hands clapped, some eyes glistened. Gabriella held Amara close, her heart swelling with a pride too deep for words. On the ride home, she looked out the window at the skyline glowing gold in the dusk and whispered to her daughter, "That's the sound of hope, baby girl. That's what we helped build." In the months that followed, Marcus expanded his vision beyond his gates. He established the Elise Foundation in memory of his late wife. Its mission: to provide childcare support for working single parents, especially mothers. The first center opened near the old laundromat where Gabriella had once worked. She attended the opening ceremony, standing beside Marcus as partners rather than employer and employee. Cameras flashed, but what the world captured was not glamour, it was grace. Amara toddled up to the podium, tugging at the microphone, and the crowd laughed softly. Marcus bent down, lifting her into his arms, and said into the mic, "This is why we're here, because no parent should have to choose between a job and their child's safety." The applause that followed was not for him, but for every unseen worker whose love had gone unnoticed. Back at the mansion, life found a quiet rhythm again. Louise baked her orange pound cakes for every new milestone. Clara started teaching English classes to the gardener's children in one of the unused parlors, and Gabriella oversaw the new staff with calm authority. Yet there were moments, usually at twilight, when she would step out into the garden alone, standing among the blooming roses that Marcus had replanted himself, and feel the gravity of how far she had come. Once she had been just another name on a payroll list, a woman scrubbing floors to keep her child fed. Now she was a voice that had shaped a movement, though she never sought credit. One evening, as the air shimmered with the scent of orange blossoms, Marcus joined her in the garden. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Inside was a deed, her name printed clearly under the title to a modest house not far from the mansion. She looked up in disbelief, her voice trembling. "Sir, what is this?" He smiled a little sadly. "It's yours, a home of your own. You've earned more than wages here, Gabriella. You've earned peace. Tears blurred her vision as she shook her head. I can't accept this. He replied quietly, You can. Because this isn't charity, it's gratitude. You rebuilt my life when you didn't have to. Let me give something back that lasts. That night, after she finally accepted, she sat on the porch of her new home, Amara asleep in her lap, and listened to the crickets chirping like soft applause. The stars above seemed nearer than ever. Across the hill, the lights of Sterling Heights twinkled faintly, no longer symbols of distance but of connection. Marcus stood by his window watching the same sky and felt no loneliness for the first time in years. He knew now that true wealth was not measured by columns of numbers but by the lives warmed in its light. Years later, when Amara was old enough to run through the same gardens laughing freely, visitors to the estate would ask about the legend of the Maid and the Millionaire. Some would say it was a story of generosity. Others called it redemption. But those who truly understood, those who had seen it happen, knew it was simply a story of two hearts choosing humanity over habit, proving that compassion, once awakened, never dies. The mansion still stood tall, but its greatest legacy wasn't its architecture or its art. It was the invisible glow of kindness that lived in every corner, every life it touched, every child who giggled in its once silent halls. And so the tale of Gabriella Moore, the humble black maid who brought her baby to work, and Marcus Sterling, the millionaire whose gesture changed lives, became more than a story whispered over coffee or printed in glossy magazines. It became a living truth carried forward by every person who believed that dignity could rise from despair, that grace could grow in the unlikeliest soil, and that sometimes the smallest act of compassion can ripple through the world like light across a darkened room, quiet, steady, unstoppable.